Happy Wednesday, church. And for today's Unmuted, I want to look at the story of Joseph, which is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. Joseph, as you know, was the favored son of his father, Jacob. Jacob had given him that robe of many colors. His brothers got jealous, threw him in a pit, sold him to slavery. Joseph ends up in Egypt and has some ups and downs throughout that entire career there, but eventually rises in rank to being second in command of Egypt, right under Pharaoh. He saves his family from the famine and, in fact, many other people in that region. And we have this amazing verse at the end of the story in chapter 50, the very last chapter in the book of Genesis. And you remember Jacob, his father, had just died, and the brothers are pretty concerned because now that Jacob's dead, what's Joseph going to do to us? So they go to Joseph and they bow down before him. And Joseph says in verse 19, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God?" And here's what he says in verse 20. "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." What an amazing verse of God's providence, isn't it? And Joseph is looking back over his experiences and seeing how God's hand has been working throughout this entire thing. How all of these things that the brothers meant for evil, God had brought good out of it. One problem with this verse, though, as you read it, is it kind of has this hindsight 2020 perspective, right? Where it's like a happily ever after, all things work together for good. Everything's rosy. But if you think through Joseph's life, it wasn't always like that, right? He was in a pit when his brothers sold him into slavery. And I'm thinking specifically of when he was in Potiphar's house. And remember, Potiphar's wife came after him and he was falsely accused, sent into prison. And while he's in prison, he interprets these dreams of the cupbearer and the baker. And as they're brought out, Joseph says, "Remember me when you leave so that I can get out of here. I'm innocent. I didn't do this." And we're told there between chapters 40 and 41 that they forgot him. And he ends up spending 2 more years, I should say, in prison. We don't know how long he was there in total. Can you imagine what that was like for Joseph? Here you are, unjustly in prison, and probably not a very nice prison. This is the king's prison, we're told, so it was probably not a very good one. And here he is wondering, where is God? And I thought I was serving him, and I had all these opportunities, and now I'm stuck in prison. 2 years. And I think one of the purposes of this story is to help us connect chapters 50 in this verse of how God works things for good, but also connecting it to a time when Joseph is in the pit, or when he's in prison, or when he's not necessarily seeing the good coming out of it. And so I think this story teaches us a few lessons. First of all, it teaches us about God, that our God is a God who providentially works out his purposes, no matter the circumstances. No action can thwart his purposes. That's the kind of God we serve. But it also teaches us about our world. Our world we live in is a world of evil. Evil happens. And a lot of times there's no reason or purpose for it. It's not something where God is trying to teach us something, or he brought this horrible circumstance into our life, or maybe I did something wrong to deserve this. A lot of times evil happens just because evil happens. That's the kind of world we live in. It's a sinful world. And we're not actually told why Joseph had to be in prison 2 more years. You could think, okay, well, maybe it taught him how to be a better administrator, or it kind of shaped his character, and I'm sure it did. But there's other ways to shape character, isn't there? Do you have to be in prison for 2 years? So we're not really told why. It's just evil happens. That's the kind of world we live in. But the third thing this story teaches us, I think, is about faith. That we don't necessarily just trust God when everything works out in the end. Not just in hindsight, we look back and say, oh, God's good. We trust God in the midst of the pain and the evil. When there is no purpose, when it seems like things are unfair and unjust. And in the midst of that, we know that the God that we serve is a God who is faithful, a God who works out his purposes, a God who loves us and has our interests in mind. and who has all the interests of the entire world working out history for his purposes. That's the kind of God we serve, and we can have faith in that God in the midst of trial, in the midst of evil. So yes, I think we will have hindsight eventually. Maybe in eternity we can look back and see how God has providentially worked things through our lives. Sometimes we get a glimpse of that in this life. But I think the lesson here is to trust in a God that there will be hindsight eventually, that we do know the God that we serve is a God who's working out his purposes and can be trusted. Well, I hope that's an encouraging word to you today from the life of Joseph.